who really sank the Lusitania. They tell us that false flags are not real, that being labeled a conspiracy theorist is a shameful thing, that looking back at our history books with a skeptical lens is the same as being ignorant to the past. But they are wrong. This is a story of the corporate media funded by the banking elite lying our way into World War I, a war which then later led the United States into World War II. World War I saw over 320,000 U.S. casualties. World War II, over 1 million. Of course, Germany and Russia each had around 3 million deaths. France had nearly 2 million deaths. The United Kingdom had around 1 million deaths. Italy had over 1 million deaths. Romania, Serbia, Greece, Belgium, Canada, Australia, Ottoman Empire, Austria, Hungary, millions dead. World War I absolutely gutted Europe of some of its bravest, strongest, and smartest men, around 20 million deaths and 20 million wounded. And World War II was worse, with 70 to 85 million total deaths. Gutted. Nations destroyed. And for what? So war profiteers and bankers could line their pockets to fulfill their sociopathic greed. Western Europe is unrecognizable to what it once was. England now arrests people for thought crimes. There is no freedom of speech, unless you are a Muslim immigrant or newly minted Englander of African descent. Political correctness has muzzled native Europeans from speaking the truth about their situations, and because World War I and II all but eliminated the bravest and strongest from the collective Western European gene pool, there is a lack of men willing to speak up on behalf of their ancestors and their posterity. No, these wars were pointless. They made J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds happy. They activated the press to spread the most costly lie in recorded human history. You see, 90% of Americans opposed American involvement in World War I, so they needed a big lie to push to the public to gain support. And now, for the rest of the story.
The same crowd which manipulated the passage of the income tax and the Federal Reserve System wanted America in the war. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and the rest of the Jekyll Island conspirators were all deeply involved in getting us involved. Many of these financiers had loaned England large sums of money. In fact, J.P. Morgan and Company served as British financial agents in this country during World War I. Gary Allen, none dare call it conspiracy.
The Lusitania sank on May 7, 1915. USA joined the war on April 6, 1917, almost 2 years after the sinking of Lusitania. A German torpedo did not sink the ship, but another explosion seconds after the first explosion, and much larger than the one possible by torpedo, was responsible for sinking of Lusitania. The ship sunk in 18 minutes, whereas if hit by a torpedo, it would have taken more than 2 hours to sink. It was carrying war material for England, as already declared in its manifesto. After it sank, British Navy mined the shipwreck to destroy evidence about what was held in its cargo hold. At the time, no ship had been torpedoed traveling at more than 15 knots. Lusitania had a speed of 25 knots and traveled at an average speed of more than 21 knots, but was asked to reduce to below 15 knots. Why? The ship could outrun any U-boat, but it was deliberately slowed down. Why? Its escort battleship Juno, which was patrolling the waters, was recalled to port and no alternative was sent out. British intelligence was aware that the U-boat was operating in the area, but no warning was sent by the Navy. Winston Churchill at that time was First Lord of Admiralty. A week before the disaster, Churchill had written to Walter Runciman, President of the Board of Trade, that it was most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hopes especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. Many highly placed persons in Britain and America believed that the German sinking of the Lusitania would bring the United States into the war. The evening before the attack, King George V asked an ambassador whether the USA would enter the war if a U-boat sank Lusitania. Churchill then went on holiday. Who was to blame for the murder of over 1,000 people? Why, an evening before the sinking, did King George know that it is going to be sunk the next day? The Navy had dispatched a cruiser from nearby Queenstown to undertake a rescue, but the ship was mysteriously recalled just as it steamed into view of the survivors. The stricken masses were left frantically waving in disbelief. Dublin-based technical diver Des Quigley, who dove on the wreck in the 1990s with Bemis permission, reported that the wreck is like Swiss cheese, and the seabed around her is littered with unexploded hedgehog mines. Royal Navy officials have claimed they had merely been practicing on the wreck, but others have said that, in fact, the Navy was deliberately trying to destroy evidence. Professor William Kingston of Trinity College, Dublin, has said, "There's no doubt at all about it that the Royal Navy and the British government have taken very considerable steps over the years to try to prevent whatever can be found out about the Lusitania." In February 2009, the Discovery Channel TV series Treasure Quest aired an episode titled Lusitania Revealed, in which Greg Bemis and a team of shipwreck experts explored the wreck via remote-control unmanned submersible. At one point in the show, it is mentioned that Cobh locals have believed for years that in the 1950s, during a 2-week period, the Royal Navy dropped depth charges on the wreck, greatly worsening its condition. It was stated that numerous Cobh residents on shore heard the blasting and saw Navy ships hovering over the area of the wreck. At one point in the show, an unexploded depth charge was found in the wreckage, in plain sight, clearly seen by the remote control submersible's video camera. Greg Bemis, as well as other people on the team, believe the British Royal Navy deliberately bombed the Lusitania site to make the wreck as unattractive as possible, to prevent further salvage and to prevent divers from going in and finding that there was contraband cargo. No government has ever admitted to the depth charging. The narrator says the depth charges probably crushed the upper decks of the ship and further scattered the debris field. Who was really responsible for killing of USA citizens, Churchill or Germany? Now the sinking. The Lusitania made her maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York in September 1907. Construction had begun in 1903 with the goal of building the fastest liner afloat. Her engines produced 68,000 horsepower and pushed the giant through the water at a speed of over 25 knots. Dubbed the Greyhound of the Seas, she soon captured the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. The British Admiralty had secretly subsidized her construction, and she was built to Admiralty specifications with the understanding that at the outbreak of war, the ship would be consigned to government service. As war clouds gathered in 1913, the Lusitania quietly entered dry dock in Liverpool and was fitted for war service. This included the installation of ammunition magazines and gun mounts on her decks. The mounts, concealed under the teak deck, were ready for the addition of the guns when needed. Lusitania departed Pier 54 in New York on May 1, 1915, for Liverpool. Unknown to her passengers, but no secret to the Germans, almost all her hidden cargo consisted of munitions and contraband, destined for the British war effort that included 600 tons of explosives, 6 million pounds of ammunition, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, and some American passengers. The Germans placed full-page newspaper ads in 50 newspapers across the USA, warning Americans not to travel aboard the Lusitania, which was carrying munitions but masquerading as an ocean liner. The German embassy in Washington had issued this warning on 22 April 1915. This warning was printed adjacent to an advertisement for Lusitania's return voyage.
Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and the travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., 22 April 1915.
As the fastest ship afloat, the luxurious liner felt secure in the belief that she could easily outdistance any submarine. Nonetheless, the menace of submarine attack reduced her passenger list to only half her capacity. On May 7th, the ship neared the coast of Ireland. At 2:10 in the afternoon, a torpedo fired by the German submarine U-20 slammed into her side. Few seconds later, a mysterious second explosion ripped the liner apart. Chaos reigned. Most passengers never had a chance. Within 18 minutes, the giant ship slipped beneath the sea. 1,119 of the 1,924 aboard died. The dead included 128 Americans. During inquiry, many witnesses testified that portholes across the ship had been open at the time of attack, and an expert witness confirmed that such a single porthole would let in 4 tons of water per minute. Why were all the portholes left open? Was it in anticipation of a torpedo attack? Interestingly, J.P. Morgan had shown keen interest in this ship. A British battleship, Juno, had been patrolling the waters serving as an escort to Lusitania. But Juno was recalled to port shortly before the attack. No alternative was sent out. British intelligence was aware that the U-boat was operating, but no specific warning was sent by Churchill. The Lusitania was capable of great speed and could have outsailed any U-boat, but the ship was traveling at only 15 knots, much below her capacity of 25 knots. Why? And the ship did not zigzag as others did to make a torpedo attack virtually impossible. Again, why? The mystery of the Lusitania's sinking began because of the speed in which she sank. In just 18 minutes, there were 2 explosions on the Lusitania, but only 1 torpedo fired, and witnesses agree that the second explosion was the larger. And it was this second explosion that doomed the ship and led to the rapid sinking that resulted in such a loss of life. 1 torpedo should not have caused a ship of Lusitania's size to sink so rapidly. Indeed, it took the Titanic close to 2 hours to sink, and if the Lusitania sank as slowly, all passengers would have been saved. Another interesting factor: there was enough lifeboats on the ship to carry all passengers. How were they destroyed? German submarine U-20's Commander Schwieger's log entries attest that he only launched 1 torpedo. Some doubt the validity of this claim, contending that the German government subsequently altered the published fair copy of Schwieger's log, but accounts from other U-20 crew members corroborate it. The entries were also consistent with intercepted radio reports sent to Germany by U-20 once she had returned to the North Sea, before any possibility of an official cover-up. The false flag attack.
The same crowd which manipulated the passage of the income tax and the Federal Reserve System wanted America in the war. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and the rest of the Jekyll Island conspirators were all deeply involved in getting us involved. Many of these financiers had loaned England large sums of money. In fact, J.P. Morgan and Co. served as British financial agents in this country during World War I. Gary Allen, none dare call it conspiracy.
J.P. Morgan had been showing curious extra interest in Lusitania. World War I officially began on June 28, 1914, when members of the Black Hand Secret Society assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Europe quickly polarized and warred for nearly a year before Americans were given their false flag reason to join.
The German government took out large ads in all the New York papers warning potential passengers that the ship was carrying munitions and telling them not to cross the Atlantic on it. Yet the sinking of the Lusitania was used by clever propagandists to portray the Germans as inhuman slaughterers of innocents. Submarine warfare was manufactured into a cause célèbre to push us into war.
Midday, May 7th, off the coast of Ireland, the Lusitania was ordered to reduce speed, and Juno, its British military escort vessel, was ordered to withdraw. The Committee of 333rd Degree Freemason and Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill knew German U-boats were in the vicinity and purposely called off Juno.
British Commander Joseph Kenworthy, on duty when the ship was sunk, later revealed that her military escort was withdrawn at the last minute, and her captain ordered to enter at reduced speed in an area where a German U-boat was known to be operating. It is clear why Germany attacked this ship, and Britain would have done the same if U.S. munitions were being shipped to Germany. The Germans, whose torpedoes struck the liner, were the unwitting accomplices or victims of a plot probably concocted by Winston Churchill, concluded author Simpson. Jim Mars, rule by secrecy. The Lusitania was a ploy. It was packed with some Morgan-owned ammunition, had been given over to England as a member of the Navy, and despite the warnings of the Germans was sent into a naval war zone, specifically to be a target, the catalyst for America's entrance to the war. Churchill ordered the Lusitania's naval escort to return to port, and the fated ship was left unprotected, to be sunk. Rothschild agent Colonel House probably knew of this plot. Records point to a discussion of it between him and Sir Edward Grey of England. Historian Colin Simpson called the sinking of the Lusitania the foulest act of willful murder ever committed on the seas. Fritz Springmeier, Bloodlines of the Illuminati.
Churchill's fellow committee of 300 member, CFR founder, and Rothschild agent Colonel Mandel House was also President Wilson's top political advisor. Wilson said,
Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would just do as he suggested.
This is a man who has also been called the Henry Kissinger of his day. In the book The Intimate Papers of Colonel House, a conversation is recorded between Colonel House and the Foreign Secretary of England, Sir Edward Grey. Grey asked,
What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? And House answered, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war.
That is exactly what happened. Around 1,200 passengers were killed, including 128 Americans.
This act set off a firestorm of anti-German feeling throughout the United States, fanned by the Rockefeller-Morgan-dominated press. Jim Mars, Rule by Secrecy.
Post-sinking exploration of the wreck. When late July 2008, Greg Bemis was granted an imaging license by the Department of the Environment, allowed him to photograph and film the entire wreck, and allowed him to produce the first high-resolution pictures of it. Bemis planned to use the data gathered to assess the wreck's deterioration and to plan a strategy for a forensic examination of the ship, which he estimated would cost $5 million. Florida-based Odyssey Marine Exploration was contracted by Bemis to conduct the survey. The Department of the Environment's Underwater Archaeology Unit joined the survey team to ensure that research would be carried out in a non-invasive manner, and a film crew from the Discovery Channel was on hand. Bemis, who found munitions in the wreck, said those 4 million rounds of .303s were not just some private hunter's stash. Now that we've found it, the British can't deny anymore that there was ammunition on board. That raises the question of what else was on board. I've always felt there were some significant high explosives in the holds. Shells, powder, gun cotton, that were set off by the torpedo in the inflow of water. That's what sank the ship. The central point to this question has always been the timeline. Torpedo strikes, then a 15-second delay, then the bigger explosion. The Germans knew that their torpedoes in no way had such explosive power. Everyone who survived said how awful it was. Listening to all these people crying for help, he muses. Just hundreds of people were about to perish in the cold water and just yelling for help. Barnes shudders, imagining the wildly tilting lifeboats spilling passengers 60 feet headlong into the sea, and a tiny periscope disappearing beneath the waves. His voice quavers slightly as he recounts the unfathomable actions of the British Royal Navy. The Navy had dispatched a cruiser from nearby Queenstown to undertake a rescue, but the ship was mysteriously recalled just as it steamed into view of the survivors, allowing them to die. The stricken masses were left frantically waving in disbelief. British false propaganda. It was in the interests of the British to keep U.S. passions inflamed, and a fabricated story was circulated that in some regions of Germany, schoolchildren were given a holiday to celebrate the sinking of the Lusitania. This story was so effective that James W. Gerard, the U.S. ambassador to Germany, recounted it in his memoir of his time in Germany, Face to Face with Kaiserism, 1918, though without substantiating its validity. And that is how the United States was tricked into getting into World War I. Once the tragedy struck, newspapers worked overtime to make sure Americans heard about the horrific attack by the Germans. The babies in incubators helped fuel America to get into the Persian Gulf War. The attacks on 9/11 led to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost. But the truth of the Lusitania is truly heartbreaking and unique because of the irreversible damage it did to American soldiers. Had we not gotten involved in World War I, had we listened to our founders who wanted America to stay out of European affairs, how would the world be different today? Can you honestly say the world would be worse, or rather, would millions of lives have been saved had America resisted the calls for war and instead brokered peace? Alternative timelines are impossible, of course. But future mistakes are avoidable. We can never bring the brave young men who died for nothing back from the dead, but we can make sure that what they fought and died for still exists. England, Germany, France, Italy, the United States. These are nations that have undergone tremendous demographic changes, once unimaginable restriction to free speech. social decay, and moral degeneracy. The only way we can honor the past is to preserve the future. The only way we can preserve the future is to recognize we are children of heroes. Our ancestors were heroes, and only heroes get to keep their freedoms. And eventually we will once again have to do hero things, with eyes open and minds aware that the devil is looking to deceive. This is Powerful Primates. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell notification for updates. I truly appreciate your support.